picture a sprawling, dominant empire.
Mm.
I mean, we're talking about one that has stood for centuries.
Right.
The architecture is just magnificent, the trade routes are totally overflowing with wealth, and the military is universally feared.
The absolute peak of civilization.
Exactly. And then, seemingly overnight, it just vanishes.
Yeah.
It shatters into a dozen warring factions, the aqueducts run dry, and the monuments are swallowed by the jungle or the desert.
It's wild to think about.
It is. And the strange thing is, the soil was still fertile. The rivers still flowed. The people were still there. So what actually killed it?
That right there is really the ultimate diagnostic puzzle of human history. Because when you look closely at these collapses, the traditional dates and the border maps, they completely fail to explain the underlying rot.
Yeah.
The physical environment didn't change at all, yet the civilization somehow collapsed under its own weight.
Which means we have to look past the science of history. You know, the who, the what, and the when.
Yeah.
And we have to wade into the beautifully messy philosophy of history. So, welcome to you, our ever-curious listener, to today's deep dive.
We have a lot to cover today.
We really do. We have a massive stack of sources to get through. We're integrating academic articles, historical research papers, and my own extensive notes on a foundational chapter titled The New Philosophy of History and the Multiplicity of Factors.
That's fantastic, Tex.
It's so good. Our mission today is to uncover the hidden engines of human civilization. We want to know why empires rise, why they inevitably fall, and what invisible forces are really pulling the strings behind human progress.
And what I love about the author of our core source text is that they don't just hand us a single master key.
No, they really don't.
Instead, they evaluate the evolution of how humanity has attempted to explain its own success and failure. And naturally, the earliest attempts to decode the secret formula, well, they started by looking at the physical ground we stand on.
Right, the geographical interpretation. And this goes all the way back to antiquity. We are talking about ancient Greek thinkers, basically looking around and concluding that their environment was the primary driver of their intellect.
The Greeks were actually the first to codify this. Hippocrates, who is often recognized as the father of medicine, and the philosopher Aristotle, observed the world and argued that climate dictated human potential.
Okay, so how did they figure that?
Well, they hypothesized that the moderate climate of the Mediterranean was like the perfect incubator for philosophy, science, and complex civic structures.
The underlying logic there, even if it feels a little, self-congratulatory for the Greeks,
Oh, very much so.
it actually makes intuitive sense when you break down the mechanics of survival.
It does.
The theory posits that if you live in a hyper-extreme climate, say the frozen tundra or a blistering arid desert, almost 100% of your daily caloric and mental energy goes into merely staying alive.
You're constantly fighting the elements.
Right. You're hunting, you are seeking shelter, you are migrating. But in a moderate, temperate climate, the environment is forgiving.
Yeah, and you generate a caloric and agricultural surplus.
Exactly. And once you aren't perpetually fighting for survival, you suddenly have the intellectual bandwidth to sit around and invent democratic institutions or chart the movement of the stars.
That surplus is totally the foundation of the 14th century scholar Ibn Khaldun's analysis, which is a massive pillar in our source material today.
I found his section so fascinating.
He argued heavily for the middle climate. To Khaldun, this moderate zone created moderation in human behavior.
Okay.
He believed that the extreme heat of the global south bred lethargy as like a biological defense mechanism against overheating.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and on the flip side, the extreme cold of the north forced a kind of physical and mental stagnation due to isolation and resource scarcity.
That is wild. And our sources actually trace this thread through later centuries, bringing in thinkers like Montesquieu and early criminologists who studied the correlation between climate and morality.
Right, the crime statistics.
Yes. There is a deeply fascinating mechanism they propose regarding heat and crime. They didn't just say hot weather makes people bad.
No, it was much more systemic.
Right. They tracked statistics showing crime spikes during hotter seasons and argued that heat increases physiological arousal, so elevating heart rates, spiking cortisol, and basically lowering impulse control.
And it changes how people interact, too.
Exactly. Hot weather pushes people outdoors into shared, crowded public spaces where social collisions are just inevitable. They essentially argued that ambient temperature has a direct, measurable impact on the ethical fabric and stability of a society.
And historically, those geographical theorists had some pretty compelling data regarding where the earliest mega-civilizations sprouted.
Yeah, the map really backed them up.
Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Yellow River in ancient China, the Indus Valley, none of them emerged in the tundra or the deep Sahara.
Right.
They all shared temperate river valleys. They benefited from fertile soil, reliable water sources, and a climate that allowed for highly predictable, surplus-generating agriculture.
Okay, let's unpack this. So early historians essentially applied the golden rule of real estate to human progress.
Location, location, location.
Exactly. Find a predictable river, settle in a moderate climate, and the natural mechanics of the environment will just generate an empire for you.
That was the idea.
But, and this is where that logic hits a massive wall for me, if geography is absolute destiny, and you have these incredible empires sitting in the exact same perfect locations for centuries,
Right.
why do they eventually collapse? Because the Nile didn't disappear.
No.
The Mediterranean didn't freeze over. The Fertile Crescent was still fertile.
Yeah.
So what happened?
That glaring contradiction forces a massive pivot in our understanding of history. When the environment remains constant, but the society crumbles anyway, you can no longer blame the geography.
Right, you have to look somewhere else.
You have to look at the internal psychology of the people. And that shifts the focus of our sources to the cyclical interpretation of history.
The idea that civilizations operate on like a biological lifespan.
Exactly. This theory models human societies as living organisms. They are born, they reach maturity, they grow old, and they die.
It's terrifyingly predictable.
It really is. Ibn Khaldun outlines this through a framework he calls the three generations rule. He estimates the total lifespan of a dominant civilization to be roughly 120 years, which is split across three distinct generational mindsets.
Walk us through the psychology of these generations, because reading this section of the text felt uncomfortably relevant to modern institutions.
Yeah, it hits very close to home.
Yeah.
So generation one consists of the builders. These are the founders.
Okay.
Geographically and socially, they almost always come from the margins. So the wilderness, the desert, or the oppressed lower classes, they are forged in hardship.
And they have that intense drive.
Right. And the mechanism that makes them successful is what Khaldun calls asabiya, or intense social cohesion. Because survival in the margins is just impossible alone, they are fiercely united.
They share the same struggle,
The same hunger and a profound sense of mutual reliance.
so they accomplish the impossible. Because cooperation is literally a matter of life and death. They do the grueling work to build the empire.
Yeah.
And then the torch passes to generation two,
The maintainers.
the maintainers.
This generation is born inside the walls their parents built. They open their eyes to wealth, stability, and bureaucratic order.
They didn't have to fight for it.
Exactly. They still revere the founders, and they mimic the traditions and the discipline of their parents, but they lack that raw grit.
Right.
The psychological shift here is subtle but profound. Their primary motivation is no longer creation or survival. It is the management and preservation of their inheritance.
Charismatic leadership gets replaced by administrative bureaucracy.
Precisely. They are managing the wealth, not generating the spark that created it.
Which brings us to the inevitable cliff edge, generation three.
Generation 3, the squanderers.
Oof, that name says it all.
It does. This generation is entirely divorced from the hardship that built the society. They are raised in absolute comfort and entitlement.
Because they've never faced an existential threat.
Exactly. So that intense social solidarity of the first generation completely dissolves into individualism and hedonism.
Wow.
And the texts note a specific fatal mechanism here. They become so accustomed to luxury that they forget how to endure physical hardship or defend themselves.
They just assume they'll always be safe.
Right. So they begin outsourcing their protection to mercenaries or surrounding tribes. And the moment a society loses the internal drive to defend its own borders, the empire falls to whatever hungry, marginalized group is waiting outside the gates.
And the cycle begins again.
The cycle begins again.
It's honestly the geopolitical version of that old family business proverb, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. The grandfather builds the company in a factory uniform. The father expands it in a tailored suit, and the grandson bankrupts it and ends up back in a factory uniform. There is a deep tragedy built into this biological model. The builders sacrifice everything to ensure their children won't suffer. But that very lack of suffering guarantees their grandchildren will be too weak to survive.
It's the paradox of success. Success generates surplus, surplus generates comfort, comfort breeds apathy, and apathy invites collapse.
Is there any way out of it?
Well, our sources don't leave us entirely without hope. The 20th century historian Arnold Toynbee modifies this cyclical doom by introducing the concept of the creative minority.
Okay, a mechanism for breaking the cycle.
Correct. Toynbee argued that civilizations die by suicide, not by murder.
Wait, suicide?
Yeah, they die when they fail to adapt to a new challenge. But a civilization can extend its lifespan if it cultivates a small, dynamic group of visionary thinkers who can accurately diagnose the decay and innovate new solutions.
The creative minority.
Exactly. If society empowers this creative minority to implement reforms, the society adapts and survives. But if the rigid, entrenched elite suppresses the creative minority just to maintain the status quo, the civilization collapses.
Okay, so if the trajectory of an empire is governed by these psychological cycles, from hungry builders to entitled squanderers, it forces us to ask what fundamental force is actually driving human motivation.
Right.
Like, are we driven by the pursuit of higher ideals, or are we just sophisticated animals driven by our material needs?
The classic clash between spirit and matter. This is where our sources dig into the heavy philosophical machinery. The spiritual interpretation is largely championed by the German philosopher Hegel.
Right.
He argued that human history is the progressive unfolding of what he called the absolute mind, or cosmic spirit.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
Because when Hegel says cosmic spirit, it sounds super mystical, but he was actually describing a structural theory of progress, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was describing the dialectic. Hegel believed that history moves forward through a necessary friction.
Okay.
The universe is a conscious entity moving toward ultimate freedom and self-awareness. So how does society improve? Through conflict.
Oh, I see.
A dominant idea or system, the thesis, encounters its inevitable opposition, the antithesis.
And they clash.
The resulting clash, which is often violent or catastrophic, forces society to forge a better, more evolved system. The synthesis.
So under Hegel's framework, even the absolute darkest chapters of history serve a purpose.
Right.
Like a cruel, oppressive tyrant isn't just a random tragedy. The tyrant actually provides the unbearable friction that forces the population to rise up, overthrow the monarchy, and invent a constitutional democracy.
Exactly. The disaster forces the innovation.
So to Hegel, the great visionary leaders of history are basically just vessels acting out the necessary evolutionary steps of this overarching human spirit. History is fundamentally driven by ideas.
Ideas and spirit govern all, but then our sources present the absolute inverse of this theory.
The ultimate materialist interpretation.
Yes.
Enter Karl Marx. And here's where we need an impartiality check. It is really important to separate Marx's 20th century political legacy from his core historical theory here. We are strictly evaluating the analytical premise presented in our texts. The idea that material conditions, not ideas, not spirit, not geography, are the exclusive drivers of human events.
Right, and Marx looked at Hegel's dialectic of ideas and flipped it entirely on its head. He argued that the economy, specifically the means of production, is the only true engine of history.
The only engine.
Yes. He believed society moves through inevitable stages, primitive communal structures, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and eventually communism.
And those transitions aren't driven by, like, big spiritual awakenings.
No, not at all. They are driven by technological changes in how we produce goods and the resulting class struggle.
It is a totally deterministic view. Marx strips away all individual agency.
He really does.
He essentially claims that if George Washington or Thomas Jefferson hadn't existed, the economic conditions of the American colonies, the taxation, the trade routes, the agricultural output, would have simply generated other figureheads to serve the exact same function.
That deterministic view is precisely what makes his theory so rigid. Marx argued that the hand mill creates a society with a feudal lord, and the steam mill creates a society with an industrial capitalist.
Wow.
The tools we use dictate the social relationships we must form. Therefore, culture, laws, art, and religion are not divine inspirations. They are merely the superstructure built by the ruling class to justify and maintain the current economic reality.
I mean, I have to push back on the extreme reductiveness of that.
Yeah.
It assumes humans are nothing more than biological calculators maximizing resource efficiency. If every piece of art, every constitutional right, and every religious awakening is just a byproduct of how we harvest grain or mine coal, where is the room for human inspiration?
It's a great question.
Right? Where is the unaccountable spark of genius that completely reshapes an era?
That critique the claustrophobia of strict determinism is exactly where the author of our core text steps in to synthesize the entire debate. The author concludes that these single-factor theories are structurally flawed. Asserting that history is dictated solely by geography, or solely by a generational cycle, or solely by the economy, is like looking at a vast, intricate mural through a tiny keyhole.
You're only seeing a sliver.
Right. You are seeing a real, valid piece of the truth, but you are utterly blind to the broader context.
Which introduces the author's ultimate framework, the multiplicity of factors.
Yeah.
And I think the analogy used in the text to explain this is just brilliant.
The fire analogy.
Yes. The author compares the genesis of human civilization to the starting of a fire. How do you start a fire? You could rapidly rub two sticks together to generate friction.
Yep.
You could cross two wires to create an electrical spark. Or you could simply strike a chemical match. The initial causes, friction, electricity, chemistry, are completely different.
Right.
But the resulting fire is exactly the same phenomenon.
Civilizations ignite the exact same way. The author argues that the spark that initiates human progress does not have to be uniform across all cultures.
It can vary.
It can vary wildly, and the author points to specific historical examples that actively break the rules of the previous theories we just discussed.
Islamic civilization is the perfect case study here because it completely shatters the geographical interpretation.
It totally does.
It didn't emerge in a lush, temperate river valley with massive agricultural surpluses.
Far from it. It originated in the Arabian Peninsula, which was an intensely arid, harsh, and geographically isolating desert.
So by Hippocrates or Aristotle's logic, that shouldn't have happened.
Exactly. A civilization of that magnitude should never have emerged there. All human energy should have been consumed by mere survival. Yet, it wasn't the geography that sparked the empire.
Right.
It was an intense spiritual drive, ignited by a visionary leader, the Prophet Muhammad. That profound religious spark took deeply fractured, warring nomadic tribes and forged them together with a unified purpose.
It happened fast.
Within decades, they constructed a sprawling civilization that became a global epicenter for mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. The spark was spiritual, overcoming massive geographic deficits.
But then the text contrasts that with the rise of American civilization, which was ignited by a completely different kind of spark.
Right. The American spark was predominantly geographic and material. It wasn't catalyzed by a single ancient spiritual text, but rather by the discovery of vast, untapped continental resources.
Endless, fertile land, timber, minerals.
Exactly. Combined with the intense economic ambition of millions of incoming immigrants looking to drastically alter their material conditions.
And crucially, the author uses this multiplicity framework to vigorously defend the role of religion against Marx's materialist dismissal.
Yes, this is a key part of the text.
Marx viewed religion purely as an opiate, right? A tool of pacification used by the ruling class to keep laborers compliant. But the author argues the historical record shows the exact opposite mechanism at play.
The text asserts that spiritual belief has historically been the ultimate psychological anchor. Rather than restricting human potential, the pursuit of the divine consistently expanded human horizons.
Oh, absolutely.
The overwhelming desire to honor a higher power gave birth to the most monumental architectural engineering of the ancient world. It drove the creation of intricate sculptures, transcendent music, and complex written languages that were initially developed merely to record sacred texts.
It wasn't just about survival anymore.
Right. Religion provided a framework of meaning that allowed early humans to endure immense material hardship and still produce lasting cultural beauty.
So if we step back and view this massive tapestry,
Yeah.
the climate, the three generations, the cosmic dialectic, the material economy, we finally arrive at the author's recipe for the survival of a civilization.
A multiplicity of factors in action.
Exactly. And it requires three distinct ingredients functioning simultaneously. First, you need the initial spark. That spark might be a perfect temperate river valley, it might be an influx of new technology, or it might be a unifying spiritual revelation.
Any of the above.
Right. Second, you must have visionary leaders with actual human agency who can harness that spark and organize the masses.
And third, you need constant, vigilant adaptation. You must empower Toynbee's creative minority.
The innovators.
Yes. The moment a society stops adapting to new environmental or social challenges, it slips into the comfortable apathy of Khaldun's third generation, and the collapse begins.
Which brings all of this soaring historical theory right back down to the ground, directly to you listening right now. Because the mechanics of rise and fall aren't just limited to ancient Rome or 14th century dynasties. These principles apply to the arc of a modern startup.
They really do.
They explain the stagnant culture inside a legacy corporation. They even map onto the trajectory of your own community projects. Enduring success is rarely just about securing the perfect geographic market or having an unlimited economic budget.
It demands a multiplicity of factors.
Yeah.
You need the initial brilliant idea, certainly, but you also need the relentless grit to execute that idea when the environment is hostile.
And the adaptation.
Right, you need the intellectual humility to continuously adapt your methods when success finally makes you comfortable.
But I want to leave you with a completely new thought to chew on today. Something that pushes the boundaries of everything we've just discussed.
Okay, let's hear it.
For the last 10,000 years, the rules of geography, the cycles of generations, and the material limits of our economies have all been bound by one undeniable fact: we were entirely confined to the surface of a single planet, relying on organic human brains.
Wow. Which raises a staggering philosophical question for the future. As we stand on the precipice of becoming a multiplanetary species, and as we increasingly integrate our decision-making with artificial intelligence, do we finally break Ibn Khaldun's cycle?
It's crazy to think about.
When geography is no longer about rivers and climates, but about terraforming dead rock in a vacuum?
Yeah.
When the creative minority innovating our survival isn't entirely human, do the old engines of history still apply?
Or are we about to ignite a spark that completely rewrites the philosophy of human progress?
We'll have to wait and see.
The messy, muddy waters of history are only going to get deeper. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.